Help me. There's a hot girl in the second row. Today on Pastors on Porn, we talk about this and other secret pastoral prayers. Well, the purpose of this podcast is to provide a source of hope and healing for pastors. And guys, that just starts with being real. I think many of us have muttered some version of this prayer under their breath on a Sunday morning. I know I have. And as I said on a previous episode, actually on an interview I did recently with Nate Larkin on the Pirate Monk podcast, I said this: only bad things happen when we have to pretend that we are not sexual people, subject to the same pulls, the same temptations as everybody else. Hence the name of this podcast and the over-the-top title. But you know what? Our lives aren't over the top. This is regular stuff for guys. And as pastors, we're guys. It's regular stuff for us as well. I mean, let me just say this. Just because we're married and we're in love with our spouses, it doesn't mean that other people cease to be attractive. You know, my wife and I have said that to each other. You know, it's one thing we need to ask God about when we get to heaven. You know, couldn't you just have added some switch into the marriage ceremony and that all of a sudden you flip that switch and now everybody else fades into the ugly background? You know, that just doesn't happen, and it just doesn't seem fair sometimes. And we've both said that to each other. Now, having said that, I really made that comment to try to normalize the struggle, but I want to get candid and turn up the heat about how we have made things much harder for us, especially for those of us who have found ourselves caught up with things like porn. And although everyone's differently, it seems to me that there's a fairly common progression that I hear over and over again as it relates to our real life interactions, whether or not you are a pastor or anybody else. So let me just walk through these stages. And the first stage is really, I would almost call a pre-stage, because it's when things like occasional porn use, we reach for them when things are difficult or we're at a weak moment. And the reason we don't hit the panic button is because it doesn't feel like it's really a problem yet. It doesn't really affect our interactions with other people. At least we don't think it does, whether our wives or the girl in the second row. And, it feels that, well, it was a bad day or it was a bad moment. And so it gets dismissed and we go on with our regular life. But I think we slowly and subtly move to the next step, where things like porn become part of our coping life. And that's when we move from this pre-stage to this next stage, and we get there without even realizing it. We become habituated to reach for it in certain situations. Now, the point of this discussion is to talk about how it affects us and the girl in the proverbial second row. And here is the connection. Whenever we make a practice of feasting on women on screen, on our phones, on the computers, on our tablets, or wherever it is, it begins to bleed into our real life glances. You know, now we're more aware of the women around us. We're more discerning regarding women's body types and appearances. Now, I know discerning, now that's definitely a misuse of the word. But once again, this is a bit of a generalization, but I would say this is a common stage for many guys. Our porn use has led us to go around with a heightened radar for sexual targets of our attention. Now, a next common stage is what I'm just going to call the fantasy stage, or crossing into the fantasy boundary, over the fantasy boundary. And at this stage, you begin to think about women that you know or you see on social occasions like Sunday morning. You know, sometimes you dress these scenarios up so they sound innocuous. Like, here's a great one. You know, if my wife ever died, who would I ever consider marrying? You know, that was a great true confession I heard from Jack Hayford. He shared that in one of It was a public meeting. He used to be the head of, or still is the head of the Foursquare denomination, and just his honesty and vulnerability. And that little thought process began to trick him into subtly moving into fantasy. It's when you begin to spend more and more time thinking about individuals you know. A related challenge I've seen from a number of guys is that now you use social media, but really you're using social media for more voyeuristic opportunities. And it's a way for you to continue a fantasy life from a safe distance. Eventually the fantasy life begins to affect our social interactions. You start looking for certain people on Sunday, or if you can't find them, you find them in your mental bedroom. Eventually, I believe we find ourselves conflicted in social or ministry occasions. You no longer feel safe or strong in your call. It's hard to treat women like sisters when they are the object of our fantasies. And that, I think, is all a part of the next stage of how this progresses in light of our interactions with others. Now, the final stage I want to talk about here is what we want to call the flesh boundary. And you go, oh, you mean in the fair, right? Well, it could be that, but I want to back things way up, because there are many ways to cross the flesh boundary that may or may not lead to a physical affair, but will take you out just as readily. Now, to clarify here, the flesh boundary is when you are now interacting with a real, live person, as opposed to someone you don't know or you'll never meet, like that porn star who wouldn't give you the time of the day if you ran across them. But this is a real, live person. It could be connecting with a real person through technology for sexual purposes. But it may not actually involve in crossing physical boundaries, just in conversation or texting or chat rooms. But it is a real person. Or, back it up even further. We've all heard the story of the well-known pastor who used flirtatious language, conversations, and communications to get something from another person that didn't cross a physical line, but in the light of day would be seen by others as clearly inappropriate. So, let's take this line back even further. We cross the flesh line when we now seek attention or affirmation from that girl in the proverbial second row, because her attention makes us feel better about ourselves. All of that, up into even an affair, all of that crosses a flesh boundary. I heard a great podcast recently, a Dr. Joe Beam. I got to get him on a podcast here. He describes a cycle where a pastor of a large church fell into sexual sin. And he said this pastor was someone with a vulnerability, in particular a need for approval. And when he met an attractive woman with a corresponding vulnerability, a need for affirmation, the possibility became a probability. Now, when the pastor began to tell himself, it's not like I'm doing anything wrong in my conversations, and then began to hide his interactions from other people who wouldn't understand, the odds of a train wreck became a high probability. Of course, it was only a matter of time before thoughts led to actions, and actions the inevitable consequences. From vulnerability to probability to high probability to action, and finally to consequence. The situation plays out in ministry over and over and over again. Now you might say, well, I haven't progressed to that point. Well, the point of this podcast is to help you intervene in your life, reach out for help so that you don't become that story. And let me be clear, nobody ever sets out to be that story. So, okay, how do we avoid this? How do I avoid that progression that you've laid out, whether my situation would look like it or not? There is a progression, and how do I keep that girl in the second row staying in the second row, not in my head and not in my bed? So, Let me give you a few pointers. Here's the first one. Tell somebody. When you tell somebody, it breaks the power. What pastor or church leader hasn't realized that there's a person in the church that they need to watch themselves around? I mean, come on. Let's become human here. And please don't hear that I am blaming women for the problem. I've had guys over the years come to me, complain about a certain woman who, is immodestly dressed. And I look at the woman and she's dressed just like every other woman would dress out there in the world. No different. And I gently try to tell them, dude, it's not them, it's you. Tell somebody. I love the story. I think it's John Maxwell who told the story of an elder of his who, shared with him a Sunday morning, I'm really struggling with a coworker and I'm just really feeling like pulled to her. And I think John said, well, tell me every Sunday how you're doing. And week after week, he would share this struggle with John Maxwell. And then I think it was a number of months later, the guy finally said, okay, I'm okay. It's all good now. And it was just that level of honesty and vulnerability. I had a pastor friend of mine that they used to pastor a church. They're not pastoring anymore. But in this church, a couple of strippers came to the Lord. And, the church apparently knew. And over the next number of months, the counseling office had a steady stream of guys who needed help. Help me. I'm struggling with my thoughts. Well, you know what? Where else are those women going to have a chance to be treated differently than sexual objects? So it's good that men ask for help, right? I just think what a great example of a grace-filled example. Yeah, we need help in that scenario. But I love the honesty and the vulnerability. Number 2, if at all possible, tell your wife. Now, why do you say if at all possible? Well, I think that's the ideal. I think in our situation, me and my wife, we over the years have said to each other at different times, I need to be careful about that person. There's something about them, either that they don't feel safe to me or I'm attracted to. So just kind of ask me about that now and again. And for us, it's real healthy, and it was a real part of safeguarding our marriage. Now, I'm not talking, I have some couples I know that go around, everybody, they're always talking about how hot other people are. I'm just going, that's just wrong. That's just weird. Don't do that. But I'm talking about something that becomes a significant struggle. And now, why I say sometimes that's not possible and you have to go to a trusted friend because perhaps you've broken trust in the past. Perhaps your relationship is not strong enough at this point. But I think with the help of a counselor, my goal and my hope would be that your relationship does become strong enough that could be the type of relationship you have where you do turn to your spouse. Here's the next thing I would suggest. Personalize that person in the second row. It's harder to depersonalize or sexualize someone that is a real person. Have them over for a meal with your wife. Have a conversation with them. Get to know them. They're a real person with strengths and weaknesses. And finally, me and my wife went to a John Gottman marriage event in Seattle, and he made this statement that I found was really fascinating. Healthy couples actively devalue attractive alternatives. So occasionally me and my wife have joked, she may be beautiful, but she's got really fat ankles, and we laugh, and whatever that is, we're just playing with it. But here's the point. You begin to remind yourself of, well, yeah, they might be attractive, but, her annoying laugh would drive me nuts, or she's a neat freak, or a vegan, or she hates football, or some way that you actively devalue because you're living in a fantasy world. That person has real problems. That person would drive you nuts. All of the things about that person, you really actively say, you know what? That person is not for me. And sometimes it takes even goofy little techniques like that to remind yourself that you are in a blessed situation. So here's the point, guys. The girl in the second row is probably a problem to you because of the problems and the activities that you have invited into your life. And I really believe as you deal with the underlying issues, you take some of these practical steps that she will take her proper place and you can get on with God's call for your life. So God bless you. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Let me just say this as well before I end. I'd love to connect with you. My email is bandofbrothers@shaw.ca, and you can find me on the website bandofbrothers.care. As well, I'm on my name, Vern Tomke, on YouTube. So I'm just getting started and connected, and so I'd love to hear from you. So God bless you again. Have yourself a great day.